So, Edward, you told us in an email about what you've seen in the U.S. left since you returned from Switzerland a year ago. You write that instead of fighting state and capital, instead of building solidarity infrastructure that could save us or at least make our decline less unpleasant, instead of reaching broader constituencies hungry for our message and ready to fight alongside us, we fight each other in ways that make us resemble our worst enemies and over topics that are at once trivial, to us anyway, for now anyway, and deadly critical, like Russia and Syria, to name but two. So how do you see the left in the U.S. today resembling its worst enemies in the U.S.? How does the left look to you like the worst of the far right?
There was an article that I translated from Klasse gegen Klasse. It's sort of like it's a German affiliate of Left Voice. Some listeners might be familiar with it, like a Trotskyist online magazine. Like around, I don't remember when it was, but it was this summer when sort of the whole Antifa thing was starting to get steam in North America. I translated this article that they had published about the origins of Antifa, right? And describing sort of like the left milieu against fascism in 1930s Germany, right? And one of the reasons I wanted to translate it and present it to our readers was there was something in that article that kind of like surprised me. As far as like one of the main problems of the two main left parties in 1930s Germany, and one of the things that prevented them from actually like forming a united front that could have honestly defeated Nazism, like suffocated in the cribs before they gained power. One of the reasons was that like both the socialists, the SPD, and the communists, the KPD, essentially like were accusing each other of being fascist, right? And they wouldn't work with each other. And I thought that sounded ridiculous, but now I'm seeing a lot of the same sort of stuff today. And so I don't know, maybe I'll describe some of the reasons for the SPD and the KPD for like behaving this way, and maybe people will sort of see parallels for themselves. But so like the SPD was regarded by the communists as like essentially a bourgeois liberal party, right? The Social Democrats, they're in government. They were, for example, perfectly comfortable relying on like the police to attack and enforce laws against the rising Nazi threat when it came to street violence and things like that. And they were also regarded by the communists as like I say, a bourgeois party that was participating in capitalism, and capitalism was part of what was producing fascism, because at that time as now, capitalism was in deep crisis, of course, and we don't need to get into all of like the economic well springs of fascist tendencies. But so communists could look at the SPD and be like, you're part of the problem, right? And in that regard, you might as well be fascist. And in the other direction, obviously, this was at the time of Stalinist Soviet Union. The SPD looked at the German communists and were like, how could you call us the fascists when you are obviously the fascists, right? Look at the sort of the pole of influence that you're orienting yourselves towards. And that's not what we want either, this kind of authoritarian communism, right? And like the problem was, of course, that like the KPD had the more militant street formations that were actually fighting the Sturmabteilung, right? The Nazi thugs in the street, but couldn't handle the fascist threat themselves. They needed the Social Democrats, who had basically control over like the entire labor movement in Germany, to mobilize their popular forces as well to support. Otherwise, they didn't stand a chance. And like electorally speaking, and this is, I guess, a contrast to today's United States, at least, is that the SPD and the KPD, had they actually been united, they had like far and away more electoral support combined than the Nazi Party, and so could have forestalled like the democratic election of Hitler.
Yeah, and in the article that you're citing, the author says both parties were wrong. A real united front against fascism was needed. A united front would mean march separately, strike together. In other words, everyone can stick to and promote their own program, but when it comes to action, you work in concert. What does march separately and strike together mean when it comes to the U.S. left and how they're currently not doing that? How can a communist strike together with someone who is a liberal Democrat?
Yeah, well, I think it comes down to identifying a common enemy, right, and agreeing that that's the attack surface that we're going to be focusing on, right? I mean, like you mentioned in the intro, a big part of the problem is that it seems like instead of fighting state and capital and fascism, frankly, in all of its manifestations in U.S. society right now, leftists prefer to fight other leftists instead of state capital and fascism because they know other leftists won't hurt them, right? It's a form of cowardice in a way, right? And especially with social media these days, it seems like there are a lot of leftists that would really, really prefer to go on Twitter and drag other leftists for whatever the hell reason, in order to, I mean, it all seems very like venal and selfish and egotistical, frankly, because they're not really doing anything by behaving this way besides like building their own brand. But like they prefer to do that than do real organizing with, like you read from my email. Than like actually reaching out to constituencies that would be eager for their message.
You also had an article at Antidote Zine last month, which you translated by Hubert Malhofer and Dieter Augenbach, headlined "The War is Also in Our Heads." You write, or they write, we operate on the assumption that hegemonic discourse and its radiating material effects are central pillars securing the current structure's continued domination. The state tries to impose its interpretation of things, its way of knowing, and often succeeds as a result of certain infrastructure at its disposal. This is how those who call themselves revolutionaries become masked delinquents and terrorists. That is a familiar example, but the narratives contained within respective discourses also function on much more complex levels in that they are not only perceived by, but indeed shape individuals. The forces at work when welfare recipients, for example, are compelled to optimize themselves. Their problems are individualized, and though they are exasperated with the lie of the American dream, they might denounce other unemployed people at the job as lazy. How important is not allowing this hegemonic discourse to guide our discussion? How important is that to bringing about real transformational, transformative change? How much do we simply have to think differently outside of that hegemonic discourse box and challenge assumptions that the majority of society embraces today?
Oh, I think it's fundamental. And it has to do with how critical it is. I mean, it's really critical that we do this, right? I mean, I'll refer back to another interview that you guys did last year with Timothy Snyder. I'm not sure that if he said this in the interview or if he referred to it or if it's from his book. I'm not entirely sure. But just two things. Like, first of all, like just pointing out that we have a year to like forestall the full constitution of tyranny in this country, and well, it's been about a year, so I'm not feeling super good about having met that goal at this point. But the other thing that he mentioned as ways to at least inoculate yourself and your community against tyranny is basically to get offline, right? Read books, get your information from books and from people, right? Go out in the community and actually meet people. That's it. And it's another thing that's really well reflected in the article you just quoted from, where they sort of talk about how, yes, there is a certain degree to which like leftist militancy, to be the biggest badass in the world, like you need to be taking risks and stuff. How many demos have you been to? How many times have you gotten tear gassed? That kind of thing. But it's just as risky and is just as worthy of praise, and it takes just as much courage to get out of this little insular left bubble that we're all in, to face outward and to engage with people who don't agree with you or who might agree with you but are coming from such a different context that it requires like a certain amount of building and conversation in order to like find some common ground. I mean, and that's what we call organizing, right? And that's the kind of thing that like say what you will about clicktivism and Twitter activism and that kind of thing. That kind of organizing just can't happen online. It has to happen in real life. It has to happen outside and face to face. And I think that like the extent to which the left at this point, to whatever extent it's retrievable at all, considering how the clock is running out, both in terms of fascism and in terms of climate chaos, I think if we're gonna get there, if we're gonna make any progress at all, it has to come from us just stopping being so self-referential, stop being so like just turned inward toward the left, and doing this whole classic circular firing squad stuff, and face outwards, right? And start thinking about how we can connect with and mobilize, like I keep saying, like this constituency that really, like a base that really is ready and has been ready, and has even like in the last year or so, I've observed myself, has been approaching radical leftist organizations, and like there are plenty of people that are disillusioned with the Democratic Party. There are plenty of liberals that have started to lean further left and investigate what they can do in this milieu, and a lot of them have either left in frustration or they've been, frankly, like booted, just excluded from these spaces on all kinds of what I think are like, again, like really sort of like petty and selfish grounds that have to do more with sort of like people protecting their fiefdoms and the purity of their spaces and their ideology than that has to do with, like we talked about before, actually like selecting a common enemy and going after them together.